This man changed the world. He made Iran the inspiration for a new, uncompromising strand of Islam.
Our bosses couldn't cope with the idea of an 80-year-old Ayatollah, which they didn't even know what an Ayatollah was, who lived on garlic and onions and yogurt, directing a revolution that was about to topple America's most important ally.
تمام این بحران‌ها را امریکا ایجاد می‌کند.
His Iran broke every rule of diplomacy. It unleashed forces that the West still cannot handle. It undermined the Western hold on the Middle East.
Iran is deliberately causing maximum problems.
Iran is a threat to world peace.
I will do everything in my power to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Everything in my power.
آمریکا و انگلیس رو نگاه بکنید. هر جا دیکتاتوری و ترور و آدمکشی است، دست اونها در کاره.
This series tells the inside story of how, for 30 years, Iran has baffled and defeated the leaders of the West. In September 1978, America's closest ally in the Muslim Middle East, Iran, was rocked by anti-government riots. The crowds, Islamists, communists, liberals, had united in opposition to the dictator, the Shah of Iran. For almost 4 decades, America had relied on Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi.
شاهنشاه‌ها کشور شاهنشاهی ایران به مردم این سرزمین باستانی.
He let cronies take the lion's share of Iran's vast oil wealth. He promoted Western culture, enraging millions of conservative Muslims. The Shah's rule was maintained by a much-feared secret police and the 5th largest military in the world, equipped with American weapons. At the White House, US President Jimmy Carter called an emergency meeting.
Our presumption was that the United States policies would be better off if the Shah did stay in power.
We were concerned that if Shah falls, the whole thing could become extremely unstable, not just in Iran, but in the region.
But on the question of how to save the Shah, the president's advisors were divided.
Secretary Vance and I both felt that the best chance the Shah had to maintain his position was to go the direction of reform, to have early elections, to take human rights steps that would gain the confidence of his people.
You first reestablish order, thereby asserting your authority, and shortly thereafter initiate reforms, having proven that you're in charge.
Brzezinski felt we should make it very clear to the Shah that we would not object in any way if he decided to really crack down very hard and use what Brzezinski came to call the iron fist.
The Shah received a mixed message from Washington. It urged him both to get tough with the protesters and to offer them concessions. He summoned William Sullivan, the US ambassador.
ازت صحبت این کردن که آیا آمریکا میخواد که من با شدت عمل به خرج بدم یا نه.
Ambassador Sullivan had to say, I have no instructions on this, Your Majesty, which left the Shah very confused.
The Shah felt he had no choice but to try to embrace the revolutionaries.
انقلاب ملت ایران نمیتواند مورد تایید من به عنوان پادشاه ایران و به عنوان یک فرد ایرانی نباشد. تضمین می‌کنم که حکومت ایران در آینده بر اساس قانون اساسی، عدالت اجتماعی و اراده ملی و به دور از استبداد و ظلم و فساد خواهد بود.
The Shah announced that he and his family would soon be taking what he called an extended holiday. Shortly afterward, the Shah and his wife left Iran.
یه مدتی است که احساس خستگی میکنم و احتیاج به استراحت.
The revolt against the Shah was inspired by this man. He was a Muslim cleric, a grand Ayatollah, Ruhollah Khomeini. He was living in exile in a quiet house in a suburb of Paris, but the house was an assembly line for the revolution. Here, Claude Chaillet, a top French diplomat, pays him a visit.
Je suis donc arrivé dans ce pavillon de banlieue, dans cette chambre vraiment dénudée. Ça m'avait impressionné. J'ai fait le rapprochement avec la cellule de moine. Il n'y a pas de canapé, il n'y a rien pour s'asseoir. Lui est assis par terre en tailleur, enturbané de noir, naturellement une barbe blanche, des yeux très vifs, scrutateur. Je leur ai dit que c'est le souhait du président des États-Unis, que naturellement il fallait laisser un peu de temps pour que Jean-Paul puisse faire front aux difficultés de l'époque et que par conséquent il souhaitait que l'ayatollah diffère son retour en Iran.
نماینده فرانسوی گفتش که آیت الله هم باید که از دولت بختیار پشتیبانی بکنه و اگر نه ارتش ممکنه کودتا بکنه. این پیغام تهدید ضمنی هم داشت بر اینکه ارتش دست به کودتا خواهد زد. به همین دلیل آقای خمینی هم عصبانی شد.
Il m'a répondu, le président Carter doit comprendre, c'est que s'il veut que les relations se rétablissent normalement, il faut naturellement qu'il cesse d'appuyer des forces contraires aux vœux du peuple. Or, j'interprète les vœux du peuple.
Khomeini's advisors agonized over choosing the right moment for him to return to Iran.
یه شب بعد از نماز مغرب عشا که امام آمدن تو اتاق که ما بودیم همه، گفتن که من به ذهنم رسیده دیگه بودن ما اینجا وجهی نداره، بریم به ایران.
During the flight, a German television journalist was allowed into Khomeini's private cabin.
Die Sonne ging gerade auf, es war die Zeit des Morgengebets. Jedenfalls, ich habe ihn nie wieder so aufgeräumt gesehen wie an diesem frühen Morgen. Das ist das einzige Mal, dass ich ihn entspannt gesehen habe lächeln gesehen. Nach dem Gebet, das war ohne großen Vorwand, übergab Khomeini ein gelbes, braunes Kuvert an Tabatabai.
Sadek Tabatabai, a favorite relative of Khomeini's, was entrusted with the draft of a new constitution embodying Khomeini's vision for an Islamic Republic of Iran. It was a dangerous document.
رو کردم به آقای شلاتور و آقای کافمن که متصدی دوربینش بود. گفتم که من یه امانتی رو به شما میدم در حالی که ضبط میشد این صحنه.
Und sagte mir, wenn wir bei der Ankunft nämlich getötet werden oder verhaftet werden, dann verstecken Sie das gut.
به ایشون نگفتم که این پاکت حاوی چی هست.
Their precaution was unnecessary. As Khomeini came down the steps, more than 2,000 years of monarchy in Iran came to an end. The man given the honor of driving Khomeini had taken on more than he'd bargained for.
بیش از اونه که فکر می‌کردیم آدم توی سالن اومد نتونستیم کنترل بکنیم. مردم ریختن، ماشینای اسکورت یعنی بین ما و ماشینای اسکورت حائل شدن. و مرتب من حس می‌کردم که دارن روی این ماشین بالا پایین میپرن. از همون لحظه رانندگی عادی نبود. توی ماشین این شب تاریک میشد. امام هم اصرار داشتن که من در ماشین رو وا کنم. ایشون هیچ به در بر رفتن. خلاص من مونده بودم چیکار کنم.
In the end, Khomeini's people forced the crowd back so that a helicopter could rescue him from his own supporters.
همچی که امام رفت تو هلیکوپتر من دیگه نفهمیدم.
من دولت تعیین میکنم، من به پشتیبانی این ملت دولت تعیین میکنم، من تو دهن این دولت میزنم.
The interim government fell. The revolutionaries began executing members of the Shah's inner circle.
The part that was difficult, I must say, on the nerves was getting up and look at the morning paper and to see people that you'd known for a long time just lying on a slab with bullet holes throughout their body.
Concerned at a possible attack, the US Embassy reduced its staff from over 1,000 to just less than 100. Then the Shah requested sanctuary in the United States.
I advised strongly against an early admission of the Shah. I'm warned that if we did, it was such a sensitive matter that there could be considerable violence, demonstrations, agitation against the United States.
My presumption was that I would not let him come into the United States.
I argued that he should be allowed because we treated him as an ally in good times, and I felt it was our responsibility to treat him as a former ally, but a friend in bad times.
The president said, well, let me ask you one question. If we do this, and as some fear, our employees in our embassy in Iran are taken hostage, then what will your advice be? And the room fell dead, and he said, I thought so.
Country after country refused the Shah entry. For months, he wandered the globe. Then he appealed once again to President Carter.
One afternoon, I got a message that the Shah was confirmed to have terminal cancer and asked me if he could come in to New York for diagnosis and treatment.
This time, Carter agreed to admit him. Iran's foreign minister, Ibrahim Yazdi, was on his way to Algeria to attend its Independence Day celebrations. Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, also attended the celebrations. Afterwards, they met in Yazdi's suite.
I told him that, first of all, we had no designs to use the Shah against the new regime in Iran. As I remember, I pointed out to him that the Shah was an ill man.
خواستیم که شما اجازه بدید که پزشکان ما برن پرونده شاه رو ببینن، شاه رو عیادت بکنن، بتوانن به ما مستقل از شما گزارشی بدن.
I didn't see the need for any procedure of this sort, which would be, in a sense, negatively reflecting on the veracity of the U.S. government.
و هر قدم شما بگید که ما برای خاطر موازین بشر دوستانه این کاری کردیم، ملت ایران نمیپذیره. قابل هضم نیست براش. حتی اگر ما سعی بکنیم مردم نمیپذیرند.
Yazdi was right. A group of Iranian students now took center stage. What they did next has poisoned relations between Iran and the West to this day.
فکر می‌کردم مثلا اگه بتونیم یه کاری بکنیم و امریکا رو به وادار کنیم که شاه رو اخراج کنه از امریکا، یه موفقیتی برای انقلاب هست. طرح در حقیقت اشغال سفارت امریکا به مدت 2 روز یا 3 روز حد اکثر و گروگان گرفتن امریکایی ها توی جلسه من مطرح کردم و 2 نفر از دوستان من مخالفت کردند.
One of those against was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, Iran's future president.
آقای احمدی نژاد گفت که این کار باعث تقویت شوروی میشه و باعث قدرت گرفتن سفارت شوروی میشه و ما اساسا توی دانشگاه‌ها و توی جامعه‌مون مشکل اصلیمون گروه‌های چپ و مارکسیست هستن.
The clerics and the communists had been allies of convenience during the revolution. Ahmadinejad thought the time had come to get rid of the communists by seizing the Soviet embassy. The others thought America was the main enemy and went ahead without him. On the 4th of November 1979, the students gathered outside the US Embassy.
دانشجویان راهپیمایی می‌کردن. ما توی اون پوشش حرکت کردیم از 2 تا 4 راه قبل از سفارت امریکا. باید دستور عملیات رو من صادر می‌کردم به فرمانده عملیات.
At first this demonstration seemed to me to be an interruption, that it was going to really mess us up on getting our timetable down. You know, it's amazing how you don't worry about the right things at the wrong time. And then when it happened very quickly, these hordes started to scale the walls.
To prevent a bloodbath, the acting ambassador ordered the Marine Guards to surrender their weapons. For the Americans, their embassy had become a prison.
شما می‌بینید که الان مرکز فساد امریکا را جوان‌ها رفتن گرفتن و امریکایی‌ها که در اونجا بوده گرفتن و اون لانه فساد را به دست آوردن و امریکا هم هیچ غلطی نمی‌تونه بکنه.
In Iran, the seizure of the embassy was hugely popular. By backing it, Khomeini won the power to sweep those who doubted him out of the government. He assumed the new role of supreme leader. This gave him the last word on every decision.
Good evening. The American embassy in Tehran is in the hands of Muslim students tonight.
Good evening. For the first time since the Iran crisis began,
The protracted hostage crisis crippled the Carter White House.
The imprisonment of 50 Americans
was seen around the world as an America no longer capable of dealing with her real problems. It humbled the administration in dealing with problems at home. It had a profound, prevailing, devastating, paralyzing impact upon our government.
The administration felt the need to act.
We began to figure out how we could extract the hostages from the Iranians.
The secret rescue plan would push America's armed forces to the limit. It called for 14 aircraft across hundreds of kilometers of Iranian desert. After refueling in the desert, 8 helicopters would fly special forces to Tehran, where they would storm the embassy. A second group would seize an airbase outside the city. From there, the hostages would be flown home. The plan was known only to President Carter and a few of his top advisors. The Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, was skeptical.
One day I remember he said, "Fritz, the rescue mission won't work." And I said, "Si, how can you say that?" He said, "I say it because I was on the Armed Services Committee staff for years. I was over in the Defense Department for years. I've been around them a lot. This will not work."
When Secretary Vance was out of town, Carter summoned his top advisors.
We decided to have a national security meeting. Vance was in Miami. Warren Christopher was his representative.
The president turned to me and asked me to review the diplomatic options. Of course, the meeting had taken me totally by surprise. The subject was so secret that Secretary Vance had never been able to share with me the possibility of a rescue. And so I just dug into the back of my head and tried to review what the diplomatic options were at the present time.
All the principals, including myself, recommended that we proceed, that the diplomatic and other options were not working.
And we voted unanimously to proceed with the rescue mission.
To get the special forces in and all 53 hostages out required 6 helicopters. To have a reserve, they sent 8.
The decision was made earlier that if we didn't have enough helicopters to bring all our hostages out, that we wouldn't bring any, because the ones remaining would undoubtedly be assassinated.
On the night of the operation, the 8 helicopters flew into a sandstorm. One turned back, One was abandoned and a third was grounded at the refueling point. That left 5.
At that point, we decided to withdraw. And we left all our equipment there and brought our people home.
But as the Americans prepared to withdraw, failure turned into disaster. A helicopter collided with the refueling aircraft. President Carter was informed at once.
I was with the president when we got the call, and the president said, have there been lives lost? And I saw his face turn white, and he said, I feared that.
8 servicemen died in the crash. It was a human tragedy and, in an election year, a political disaster. The members of Congress still knew nothing of the mission. Walter Mondale had to break the news in the middle of the night.
You can imagine those very painful conversations. Awakened from a dead sleep, being told this, and they say, what are we doing? Where? When? How did we get into this? What do you mean lives lost?
I went on television the next morning, beginning at 6 o'clock, to tell the American people what happened, and it was all my fault. It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation. It was my decision to cancel it when problems developed.
Khomeini was quick to respond.
کی این هلیکوپترهای آقای کارتر را ساقط کرد؟ ما ساقط کردیم؟ خدا ساقط کرد.
In the wake of America's humiliation, Khomeini agreed to name his price for releasing the hostages. His negotiator, Sadek Tabatabai, met President Carter on neutral ground in West Germany.
ما قدم می‌زدیم در باغ کاخ مهمان سرای وزارت خارجه بن که خبر دادن که دوستان آمدند. وقتی من آمدم آقای کریستوفر از رو آمد، من در قیافش تعجب رو می‌دیدم.
I was really quite surprised. He was a very good-looking, dapper man in a sport coat and flannel slacks, and so he looked very Americanized.
بعد از صحبت‌های اولیه و معارفه اولیه که بینمون صورت گرفت، شرط رو من عنوان کردم. یکی اینکه بازگردوندن دارایی‌های مسدود شده ایران و اموالی که یعنی تنخواهی که بر اساسش دولت پنتاگون تجهیزات نظامی به ایران فروخته بود.
With respect to the funds that we had frozen in the United States, I told him we had about $5.5 billion frozen, and we're prepared to assemble those assets and return them to Iran.
دو موردش رو خیلی تونستیم همون روز به نتیجه برسیم.
The two men agreed to meet again. If President Carter could free the hostages, it would boost his chance of re-election. But a third country intervened.
وقتی که من رفتم به فرودگاه، خلبان آمد که برج اجازه پرواز به ما نداده. گفتن که فرودگاه مهرآباد بمباران شده توسط نیروهای عراقی.
Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which had a long-standing border dispute with Iran, had launched a massive invasion. Iran's leaders broke off the talks with America. They suspected Washington was behind the invasion, and they weren't entirely wrong.
We were warned that the invasion was imminent. A source told me that he'd just been in Iraq, where he'd been meeting with Saddam Hussein and his senior Iraqi generals, and that the Iraqis were going to invade Iran. This was, of course, big news and quite an intelligence coup for us.
America did not use this intelligence to stop the invasion. On the contrary, it allowed help to reach Saddam.
We understood that what we were telling Saudi Arabia and Jordan about our perceptions of the state of the Iranian military would be passed to Iraq. How powerful did we think their armed forces were? Could they operate their tanks? Could they operate their surface-to-air missile networks? These were the types of information that we would provide to our friends and which we expected they would pass on to Iraq.
Iran needed weapons, but no country would supply them while it kept the hostages. Parliament voted to resume negotiations. But it was now only 48 hours until the day of the US presidential election, and Jimmy Carter lost.
I promised you 4 years ago that I would never lie to you, so I can't stand here tonight and say it doesn't hurt.
Now he was determined to get the hostages home in the 2 months before Ronald Reagan took over. The negotiations moved to Algeria. The final sticking point was the $9.5 billion worth of Iranian government assets that had been frozen in American banks since the seizure of the U.S. embassy.
I said to the foreign minister, the most we can assemble is $7.9 billion. And I think it's in their interest to accept that, because dealing with President Reagan might be much more difficult than dealing with us.
It was the Americans' final offer.
I got a call from the foreign minister saying, I think we have an acceptance. So I went back and signed in the clothes I'd been wearing for 3 days.
But Iran wouldn't release the hostages before America delivered the money, and President Carter was to leave office in 30 hours.
There were immense technicalities that had to be dealt with. Banks in like 4 different countries, all of these escrow accounts, and we'd just about come to the conclusion that nothing could possibly be done, that they were just going to have to deal with the next administration.
I never went to bed at all. I stayed up and I was in charge of every detail of the agreement. That ought to be kept firm.
The $7.9 billion worth of frozen Iranian assets held in banks around the world still had to be retrieved.
One of the key ones was the Bank of England, because they were holding about $2 billion of gold bullion that was owned by Iran. Tell them I would like to know from the president or chairman of the Bank of England why they have held up our hostages. We had to get Mrs. Thatcher to agree to let that $2 billion be in the pot. Okay, so the Bank of England has certified the depository? Right on, man. That's great. That's great.
That was one obstacle overcome, but there were more.
Suddenly, the lines went dead. Nothing was happening. We found out that there was a U.S. Treasury official who didn't like the deal, whose signature was necessary to move the papers forward, who went home. So the President of the United States said, this person is fired, and so we got past that.
The hostages had been held for 444 days. Just a few hours before Ronald Reagan's inauguration, they were assembled in Tehran.
We were all blindfolded. I can remember my irritation with one of the hostage takers who were pushing us on the bus, because we were always being pushed around.
In Washington, Vice President Mondale and President Carter were preparing to leave for Ronald Reagan's inauguration.
As I left the Oval Office, there was Gary Sick sitting by the president's chair in his own smaller chair on the phone, waiting to see if there's any news about the hostages.
I was listening with one ear to the reports coming out of Tehran about where the hostages were and what was going on.
But the hostages' plane sat on the runway.
Carter was despairing because he had hoped at least to get these hostages home while he was president.
We rode in a limousine to the Capitol for the inauguration ceremony. I had direct communication, obviously, with our intelligence around the world.
I talked to him while he was in the car. Said that the hostages were apparently at the airport, but we had no evidence that anything had happened.
Repeat after me. I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office.
Carter left for home. There was still no news.
Roughly 5 minutes after I was no longer president, the Secret Service agent came down and whispered in my ear that the hostages were free.
They had deliberately delayed its release until maybe 20 seconds after Reagan had been sworn in.
In 1982, Ayatollah Khomeini followed up his triumph over Carter with an attempt to spread the Islamic revolution outside the borders of Iran. When Israel invaded Lebanon to remove Palestinian fighters based there, Iran's Revolutionary Guards helped Lebanese Muslims resist.
اون موقعی بود که ما 1000 تا نیرو برده بودیم به لبنان که در یه منطقه نزدیک مرز لبنان و سوریه خواهش کردیم یه پادگان خالی کردن به ما دادن، نیروها رو بردیم اونجا که جوانای لبنان رو آموزش بدیم. حتی بعدن خودشون هم به اصطلاح مدرب یا آموزش دهنده تربیت کردیم و دیگه خودشون این کارو کردن.
This new group called itself the Party of God, Hezbollah.
قرروا أن يفيدونا في إنشاء المقاومة. يعني التدريبات أو الخبرة أو الخبراء العسكريين اللي كانوا يعني يستفيد منهم شبابنا كان نفس حضور الإيرانيين معنويا كان مهم جدا لشبابنا والناس اللي خدمنا في مواجهة العدو الإسرائيلي.
که این کار رو کردیم و این نیروی مقدس و قابل احترام به نام حزب الله تشکیل شد.
Hezbollah soon became the most effective Lebanese fighting force. At the same time, President Reagan sent US Marines to Lebanon as part of a multinational force to try to restore order. They became a target.
I was awakened at about 2 o'clock in the morning and told that a suicide bomber had bombed our Marine barracks and we lost 243 Marines.
At the same time, another suicide bomber hit a French barracks, killing 58. These attacks shook the leaders of both countries.
We woke up the president. It was the low point of the Reagan presidency for me, for the president, and all of us.
For 4 months, Washington stood firm. Then, faced with more threats, the Marines were withdrawn to ships in the Mediterranean.
We knew we had to take the Marines out, so we left, and I think we left with our dauber down. I had to hand it to the French. They left too. But they marched out with their band playing. And
خروجها من لبنان يشكل بالنسبة لنا انتصار.
A group calling itself Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility for both attacks, but the US and France blamed Hezbollah and Iran.
بله ما کمک‌هایی کرده بودیم ولی ما اطلاع نداریم که از همین‌ها استفاده نکردن. ملت لبنان توسط یک ارتش خارجی اشغال شد، برای دفاع از خودش شهید داد.
But this success in exporting Khomeini's revolution came at a high price. America added Iran to its list of state sponsors of terrorism, making it even more difficult for Tehran to buy arms. In Lebanon, groups linked to Hezbollah took to kidnapping Westerners. Over the next 5 years, they took more than 40 hostages. And Iran's war with Iraq continued. At great cost, Iran's army turned back the Iraqis and threatened Saddam Hussein. Saddam had chemical weapons, and he used them.
هر کسی در هر حالی بود، اونایی که درست در معرض قرار گرفته بودن، مرده بودن. یکی از پنجره خونش آویزون بود، یکی تو خیابون افتاده بود.
Iran demanded action from the United Nations.
Et c'était une violation de la Convention de Genève. Les membres du Conseil de sécurité n'étaient pas intéressés à se mettre à dos, n'est-ce pas, le régime de Saddam Hussein.
یک چنین جنایت مستمری سالها ادامه داشت و اونها عکس‌العمل مناسب نشون ندادن، باعث شرمندگی شورای امنیت بود.
The US was torn.
It's a very hard balance. They're using chemical weapons, so you want them to stop using the chemical weapons. At the same time, you don't want to see Iran win the war.
In 1988, Hashemi Rafsanjani was in charge of Iran's war effort. He now saw American support for Saddam as an insurmountable problem.
بله خب جنگ به جایی رسیده بود که طرف ما چراغ سبز گرفته بود به هر جا و هر نحوی که میخواد برخلاف مقررات بین المللی عمل بکنه.
هم سیاستمدارا هم فرمانده جنگ به این نتیجه رسیده بود که اگر نمیتوانید جنگ رو به سرعت تمام کنید مقطعی است که آتش بس رو بپذیریم.
Rafsanjani prepared to put the case to Ayatollah Khomeini. He spent nights pacing the battlefield.
احساس شد که برای ایشون سنگینی که اعلان بکنن با شعارهای قبلی که مخصوصا گفته شده بود اگر 20 سال هم طول بکشه ما ایستاده ایم.
When he called on Khomeini to make peace, he was taking a big risk.
من یه پیشنهادی کردم به امام، گفتم که من جانشین شما و فرمانده جنگ هستم. من اعلام میکنم مسئولیت رو به عهده میگیرم، شما بعد میتونید منو محاکمه بکنید اگر به عنوان این که نظر شما نبوده و برای اینکه مردم بدونن شما راضی نبودید از این کار، ولی من این کار رو میکنم. ایشون یه نگاهی کردن گفتن نه این هم اقدام حقی نیست، اقدام ناحق میشه و گفتن خودم میکنم.
خوشا به حال جانبازان و اسرا و مفقودین و خانواده های معظم شهدا و بدا به حال من که هنوز ماندم و جام زهرآلود قبول قطعنامه را سر کشیدم.
Less than a year later, Khomeini was taken to hospital with stomach cancer.
به من اطلاع دادن که لازمه که در بیمارستان در جماران باشم. وقتی که وارد شدم امام رو دیدم و امام هم چشمشون باز کردن منو دیدن، به چشمشون به آسمان بود. باز یه دفعه متوجه شدن که چشمشون بسته شد و همون لحظاتی بود که دیگه ایشون داشتن جان میدادن.
Khomeini died on the 3rd of June, 1989. One of the few real revolutionaries of modern times, he still inspires millions. But he was also a ruthless, tough-minded political leader.
مشکل بود که خب شخصیتی مثل امام اون روزها ما در کشور نداشتیم که بتونه به آسانی جای امام رو پر بکنه.
In June 1989, Iran's top 80 Islamic clerics gathered to choose the new supreme leader. They picked a close ally of Khomeini, Ali Khamenei. He responded with a show of modesty.
ببینید من در بحث من به هر حال مخالفم.
موافق هستن قیام بفرمایید بشمارید.
Over the next 2 days, they buried Ayatollah Khomeini. Millions gathered to mourn. Soon after the funeral, Hashemi Rafsanjani became president, number 2 in Iran's political hierarchy. America also had a new president.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully...
High on his agenda were the Americans still held hostage in Lebanon. His predecessor, Ronald Reagan, had tried to trade arms for the hostages, leading to a scandal dubbed Iran-Contra.
We had no relations with Iran. We couldn't negotiate. We didn't want to negotiate for hostages anyway. And that led him to the notion of reaching out in a way to Iran with this subtle statement.
There are today Americans who are held against their will in foreign lands and Americans who are unaccounted for. Assistance can be shown here and will be long remembered.
Then the new president delivered a carefully crafted phrase.
Goodwill begets goodwill.
It was a signal. It was a gesture. You do something nice for us, and we'll do something nice for you.
The new administration turned to the United Nations.
Un coup de téléphone de Monsieur le Président des États-Unis, George Bush, père. Et alors il m'a dit sa préoccupation, son angoisse presque de la situation des otages.
We explained to him we couldn't pay, we were not prepared to negotiate, but we wanted help to get our hostages back.
Le président serait disposé à faire certaines concessions aux Iraniens, mais à condition que ça n'implique pas une négociation ou une intervention directe des États-Unis.
He said he had somebody that he used with Iran and with Hezbollah, and could do it very quietly and very subtly.
The Secretary General sent his troubleshooter, Gianni Pico, to Tehran. His mission was to get President Rafsanjani to help America get its hostages back. It meant asking Rafsanjani to take a big political risk.
It was my first encounter with the Rafsanjani president. I said to him, President Bush de facto asked to help in the release of the American hostages in Beirut, and that this help will not go unrewarded.
گفتم اولا ما نمیدونیم این گروگان‌هایی که میگن آمریکایی‌ها میگن هست در لبنان یا نه.
Rafsanjani was apparently just testing the UN representative. He soon made his conditions clear.
اگر حسن نیتشون رو نشون بدن ما مطمئن بشیم اینا جدیان و اگر کاری از ما ساخته باشه ما به خاطر هم لبنان هم به خاطر مسائل انسانی این کار رو خواهیم کرد.
Basically that was it at that point.
But then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. The US drove him out in February 1991 and installed its own troops across the Gulf from Iran. President Rafsanjani now decided that Iran must show goodwill to America. He summoned the commander of the Revolutionary Guards.
آقای هاشمی به من گفت که چیکار میشه این کار؟ میشه کاری بکنیم یا نه؟ من یکی از فرماندهان سپاه را فرستادم لبنان. رفتن با بچه‌های حزب الله صحبت کردن. اونا به شدت مخالفت کردن.
The general decided to show Hezbollah where the power lay.
من اصرار کردم که تو تا اینا آزاد نشدن بمون اونجا. وقتی بچه‌های حزب الله دیدنشون خیلی اصرار میکنه، عده‌ای از آدمای تندشون شبانه با ساختمان برادر ما حمله کرده بودن، چند تا RPG زده بودن تو اتاقش که ایشون فرار کنه بیاد ایران. ولی ایشون مونده بود و با مسئولان حزب الله بالاخره مسئله رو تمام کرد.
ما يعني من يملك المال يملك السلطة. دولة بحجم إيران ينافسها أفراد لا يملكون شيئا، شيء طبيعي أن تغلبهم.
By February 1992, all the hostages had been released. The last American out was reporter Terry Anderson, who'd been held for almost 7 years.
Mr. Anderson, your freedom is a victory for all. Welcome back. Thank you, sir. I'm very grateful to you.
Now, Iran waited for America's side of the goodwill deal.
The Iranians start calling me and say, well, what's happening? What's happening? We are in a difficult position at home. They say the president has helped the Americans, and now where is the thank you note?
Johnny Pico said the Iranians are expecting a gesture. And he said, we've got to be fair because I promised them. And I said, Johnny, I will try. I sat down with the National Security Council principals and we discussed it, and I said, we have a commitment. And the president was sympathetic to me.
The problem, as I told General Scowcroft in that meeting, was the Iranians were now deeply engaged in other acts of terrorism that made it very, very hard to do anything to improve the relationship.
In the 3 years following President Bush's promise, many critics of the Iranian regime had been assassinated in the West, and a bomb destroyed the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. America blamed Iran.
When we said goodwill begets goodwill, we did not say, if the Iranians release the hostages no matter what else, we are going to respond favorably. We said goodwill would beget goodwill. Well, doing other acts of terrorism is not my definition of goodwill.
Everyone else said Iran is behaving so badly in so many different ways that now to reward them by lifting some of the sanctions we had, or making trade deals, or some of the things that would have, that the Iranians would have wanted, is just impossible for us. And I lost the argument.
وقتی که آمریکایی‌ها درست عمل نمی‌کردن به وعده‌هاشون، کار ناقص می‌موند.
For his remaining 5 years as president, Rafsanjani made no further attempt at political reconciliation with America.